Imagine a nation that proudly calls itself the stronghold of freedom and democracy, a country where ideas of personal independence, Republican virtues, and equality before the law flourish daily, and at the same time, this very country is being torn apart by contradictions rooted deep in its economy, culture, and morality. Such was America in the mid-19th century. In 1860, the United States stood on the brink of an abyss. The cotton plantations of the South fed Europe and grew wealthy on slave labor. The industrialized North, on the contrary, viewed slavery as an anachronism that disgraced the nation. The country's political map had become a minefield. Any compromise could explode at any moment. And finally, the election of Abraham Lincoln was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The American Civil War was not merely a slaughter between North and South. It was a clash of two models of civilizational development, two moral systems, and two economic paradigms. It was a story of politicians who tried to prevent the inevitable, soldiers who marched to death for their ideals, and a society that paid for its contradictions with hundreds of thousands of lives. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy slow-paced, in-depth stories. And please write in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. We are very curious to know from which corners of the world you are joining us. To understand how America came to the brink of self-destruction, we must go back several decades to a time when the country was just beginning to rise in power. At first glance, the United States was confidently expanding westward. The economy was booming, and international affairs allowed it to avoid major wars. Yet beneath this surface of prosperity, deep contradictions were festering. The North and South of the United States had developed along very different economic paths from the very beginning. The North was rapidly industrializing. Factories, railroads, financial institutions, banks, and industries were flourishing. Boston, Philadelphia, and New York became centers of trade and industrial might. The South, in contrast, remained an agrarian civilization. Its wealth depended on vast plantations of cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugarcane. All of this required cheap labor, which came in the form of millions of enslaved people, forcibly brought from Africa or born into slavery. The paradox was that the South's wealth largely fueled the North's financial power. Cotton was a strategic commodity for British and French textile factories, and New York banks generously financed the Southern plantation economy. Slavery was both an economic and moral issue. For the South, it was a vital institution. Without it, the entire economic system would collapse. For a growing segment of the North, slavery had become an intolerable stain on the nation's ideals of freedom. The founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833 was a landmark event. Figures such as William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Beecher Stowe helped shape public opinion against slavery. Their speeches, books, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, and newspapers captured the American imagination. As the United States expanded, the question arose, should slavery be allowed in the new territories? Each time, the debate tore American politics in half. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily diffused tensions. Slavery was allowed in new states south of the 30-60-30 parallel, with Missouri as an exception. But with every new territory the debate reignited. The Compromise of 1850 again sought to ease tensions. California entered as a free state, but a harsh new Fugitive Slave Act was passed, requiring all citizens to assist in returning escaped slaves. For the North, this was a moral shock. For the South, a temporary victory. During this period, three towering political figures, often called the Great Triumvirate, dominated Congress. Henry Clay, Kentucky, the architect of compromises who tried to maintain balance between North and South. Daniel Webster, Massachusetts, a brilliant orator who fought for Union unity. John C. Calhoun, South Carolina, a staunch defender of states' rights and slavery. Despite their efforts to preserve balance, the crack widened. The idea of states' rights, strongly promoted by Calhoun, became the ideological foundation for the South's eventual secession. In the 1850s, the situation radicalized rapidly. Each compromise became a temporary patch on a ship's ruptured hull. War was brewing, even if not everyone fully realized it yet. If previous decades still offered an illusion of stability through compromise, the 1850s turned into a time of political fever. No compromise could any longer contain the growing crisis. America was slowly but inexorably drifting toward catastrophe. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Its author, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, sought to resolve the territorial issue through popular sovereignty, allowing each new territory to decide for itself whether to permit slavery. But this act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and opened the door to the legalization of slavery in areas where it had previously been banned. The North erupted in outrage, while the South saw renewed hope for slavery's expansion. Kansas became a symbol of lawlessness and civil disorder. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery supporters flooded into the new territory, hoping to influence its future status. Violent clashes broke out. Settlements were burned, attacks launched, and armed skirmishes became routine. At times, Kansas resembled a miniature civil war. One particularly infamous event was a raid led by abolitionist John Brown in 1856, where he and his followers killed 5 pro-slavery settlers. This only further inflamed national tensions. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court issued one of the most controversial decisions in American history. In the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, the court ruled that African Americans could not be citizens of the United States. Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. This decision shattered any remaining hope for peaceful settlement and effectively legalized slavery across the entire country. For the North, it was a death sentence. For the South, a triumph. In 1859, John Brown attempted what politicians had failed to do: free the slaves by force. He organized an armed raid on a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to spark a widespread slave uprising. However, the plan failed. After 2 days of fighting, Brown's forces were crushed, and he was captured. He was tried and executed. Yet John Brown became a martyr for abolitionists and a demonic symbol for the South. By 1860, the political landscape had fully fractured. The Democratic Party split into Northern and Southern factions, each nominating different candidates. The newly formed Republican Party, created in response to the expansion of slavery, nominated Abraham Lincoln. His victory was an unmistakable signal to the South. Their political dominance was over. Although Lincoln did not advocate for the immediate abolition of slavery, his election was perceived as a mortal threat to the institution. Less than 2 months after the election, the first state, South Carolina, declared its secession from the Union. The chain of events leading to war had been set in motion. When it became clear that compromise was no longer possible and political power had decisively shifted into the hands of slavery's opponents, the South decided to act. The events of late 1860 and early 1861 marked the first open act of the country's disintegration. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to declare its secession from the United States. Its politicians justified the move by invoking states' rights and alleged constitutional violations by the federal government. But at its core, the issue was slavery. Following South Carolina, 10 more states seceded: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. By the summer of 1861, 1/3 of the country no longer recognized the central government in Washington. In February 1861, delegates from the seceded states gathered in Montgomery, Alabama, and created a new nation, the Confederate States of America, CSA. The Confederate Constitution established the protection of states' rights, the official legalization of slavery, limits on central government authority. Jefferson Davis, a senator and former U.S. Secretary of War, was elected President of the Confederacy. His Vice President, Alexander Stephens, delivered the infamous Cornerstone speech, openly declaring that the Confederacy was founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. In March 1861, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. His inaugural address was a restrained attempt to calm the situation. "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. But the Union is perpetual." Lincoln's position was simple. Secession was illegal. States could enjoy autonomy, but they could not leave the Union at will. The rupture became irreversible on April 12, 1861, when Confederate artillery opened fire on the federal garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Federal troops under Major Robert Anderson surrendered after 34 hours of bombardment. Though no one died during the battle, the symbolic significance of the attack was enormous. The next day, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. In response, additional states joined the Confederacy. Washington remained the capital of the United States. The Confederacy first designated Montgomery as its capital, later moving it to Richmond, Virginia. Both sides began organizing armies. The North, Union Army; the South, Confederate Army. Both armies rapidly swelled, recruiting farmers, workers, townspeople, and even teenagers. What had started as a political conflict now became a war of peoples. When the first shots rang out over Fort Sumter, no one imagined that this war would drag on for 4 bloody years, claim over 600,000 lives, and completely reshape America's political system. Both North and South expected a swift victory, Both sides drastically underestimated the scale of the tragedy they had set in motion. The first major clash was the First Battle of Bull Run near Manassas, Virginia, on July 21st, 1861. The North's initial plan was a rapid advance toward the Confederate capital, Richmond. The Union Army, led by General Irvin McDowell, faced Confederate forces under Generals Joseph Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard. The battle was chaotic and bloody. Its turning point was the heroic defense by the brigade of Thomas Jackson, who earned his famous nickname, Stonewall Jackson. The North suffered a crushing defeat. Panic even overtook civilian spectators who had arrived for a picnic to watch the battle. The illusion of an easy victory was gone. After the shock of their first defeat, both sides began to systematically organize their military forces. The Union formed the Army of the Potomac, while the South organized several armies around key strategic locations. Command of the Union forces went to George B. McClellan, a brilliant organizer, but an extremely cautious battlefield commander. He built a disciplined army, but his hesitation would become a recurring frustration for Lincoln. In the South, Robert Edward Lee emerged, a model officer and master tactician who would later become a Confederate legend. The Union's main strategy became a naval blockade of the South, the Anaconda Plan, proposed by General Winfield Scott. The idea was to gradually strangle the Confederate economy, cut off trade routes, seize the Mississippi River, and block access to European markets. Though the South hoped for British or French support through cotton diplomacy, European powers remained neutral, unwilling to openly back a slave-holding society. Simultaneously, fighting intensified in the West. Control of the Mississippi River, America's main transportation artery, was especially crucial. Here, the military talent of Ulysses Simpson Grant, the future Union commander-in-chief, became evident. His victories at Fort Donelson and the Battle of Shiloh laid the foundation for a future strategic turning point. The American Civil War became a laboratory for new forms of warfare, railroads for troop movement, telegraphs for command coordination, mass trench warfare, steam-powered warships, ironclads, all transformed this war into a harbinger of 20th century conflicts. But by early 1862, the war was only just beginning. The greatest dramas were still ahead. After the uncertain early years, the war entered a new phase. Both sides increasingly realized there would be no quick campaign. The war was becoming a contest of resources, strategy, human endurance, and political will. In September 1862, Robert E. Lee's army launched its first invasion of the North, hoping to sway Maryland to join the Confederacy and provoke international recognition for the South. On September 17th, the Battle of Antietam, Sharpsburg, unfolded, the bloodiest single day in American history, with over 22,000 killed, wounded, or missing. There was no clear tactical victor, but strategically, Lincoln seized the moment to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war into a fight not only for the Union, but also for the abolition of slavery. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate-controlled territories to be free. Although it did not immediately free any slaves, slavery still existed in Union-controlled areas, its political impact was immense. The war now became an ideological battle for freedom. European powers lost any moral justification to support the Confederacy. African Americans began enlisting en masse into Union forces. Over 180,000 soldiers would serve. On July 3, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg ended, the largest and one of the most decisive battles of the Civil War. Lee had again invaded the North, hoping for a quick victory that would force the Union into peace negotiations. But after 3 days of fierce fighting, the Confederacy was defeated. Over 50,000 casualties were suffered by both sides. This is where the infamous Pickett's Charge occurred, a disastrous Confederate assault that ended in total failure. After Gettysburg, Lee's army would never again go on the offensive and would remain on the defensive for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, in the West, Grant secured another strategic victory. On July 4, 1863, the city of Vicksburg surrendered, the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. As a result, the Union gained full control of the Mississippi. The South was effectively split in two. The Confederacy lost access to its western territories. By the end of 1863, it became clear the North's economic and demographic superiority was taking its toll. Industrial resources, railroads, manpower, and cutting off the South from world trade steadily eroded the Confederacy's chances. Only one question remained. When and at what cost would this tragedy end? With each passing month, the war became a merciless, bloody mill grinding armies, cities, economies, and the fates of millions. For many soldiers and civilians, the war turned into endless pain, sleepless nights under the roar of cannons, hunger, disease, and death. But the end was inevitable, and it gathered unstoppable momentum. In the fall of 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman launched his legendary campaign, the March to the Sea. His troops invaded the very heart of the Confederacy, Georgia, leaving behind burned cities, destroyed infrastructure, and a demoralized population. Sherman systematically targeted the South's economic backbone, factories, warehouses, railroads, mills, everything that supported the Confederate war machine. His philosophy was simple and cold. War is hell, and the sooner the people feel the full weight of its horrors, the sooner peace will come. The march ended with the capture of the port city of Savannah. Sherman then turned north, devastating South Carolina, leaving only ashes behind. By the winter of 1865, the South had lost almost everything. Robert E. Lee heroically defended Richmond and Petersburg, but resources were exhausted, armies were dwindling, and desertion spread rapidly. In April 1865, Ulysses Grant's forces broke through the Petersburg defenses. Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell. Jefferson Davis himself was forced to flee. Lee attempted to withdraw the remnants of his army, but was surrounded. On April 9, 1865, in the small town of Appomattox Courthouse, a meeting took place that would go down in history. Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant met to sign the surrender, a famous gesture of humanity. Grant allowed the Confederates to keep their horses so they could work their fields in the spring. The war was officially over. 4 years of horror had finally ended. Even the end of the war did not pass without tragedy. 5 days after the surrender, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. There, he was fatally shot by actor and Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln died the next morning, the symbol of unity, courage, and moral strength passed away at the moment of his greatest triumph. The war claimed over 620,000 lives, more than any other conflict in American history. Millions were left wounded, widowed, orphaned. Cities lay in ruins. Economies were shattered. But slavery was abolished. The Union was preserved. America entered a new era, one of reconstruction, contradictions, and a long, painful healing process. When the last cannons fell silent, America faced a new challenge: how to heal wounds of such depth as it had never known before. Victory in war did not automatically mean victory in peace. Decades of difficult, contradictory, and painful reconstruction lay ahead. The southern states lay in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, railroads, bridges, factories, agriculture paralyzed, an economic system built on slavery dismantled, millions of freed slaves without land, means of livelihood, rights, or education. Many white Southerners saw defeat not as the end of conflict, but as the beginning of a new one, a struggle to preserve social dominance. The period of Reconstruction, 1865-1877, became a new kind of battlefield, this time political. Major steps included 13th Amendment, 1865, total abolition of slavery. 14th Amendment, 1868, granting citizenship and equal legal protection to all. 15th Amendment, 1870, voting rights for men regardless of race. The Republican government sought to rebuild the South on principles of equality, but met fierce resistance. Terrorist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using violence, terror, and intimidation to restore the old order. A political deal following the election of 1876 effectively ended federal involvement in the South. Union troops were withdrawn, and white Democrats gradually seized power, reinstating segregation laws, the Jim Crow system. For African Americans, this marked a new form of oppression that would last for nearly another century. The war left a profound mark on America's collective memory. Cults of heroes on both sides, the mythologizing of the Confederacy, Northern pride in preserving the Union, unresolved debates over race, power, and freedom. Some of the conflicts from that era: federal power versus states' rights, minority rights, and equality, remain relevant even today. The American Civil War ended more than a century and a half ago, yet its shadow still lies upon American soil. It was a conflict that did not simply redistribute power. It shattered and reshaped the very soul of the nation. America emerged from that war as a united country, but with a broken heart. Issues of racial inequality, states' rights, federal power, and political polarization remained deeply embedded in the DNA of American politics. And now, in the 21st century, many ask a troubling question: is America once again approaching the same dangerous edge? When we witness the deepening polarization of society, information civil wars in the media and on social networks, political hatred and the radicalization of both sides, debates over minority rights, immigration, gun control, and federalism. All of it echoes the very same debates that tore the nation apart in the 19th century. Modern America, like its predecessor, once again faces a choice. Will it remain a nation capable of reinventing itself? Or will it allow old wounds to burst open once again? The history of the American Civil War is not simply a tale of the past. It is a warning, because no democracy is immune from self-destruction. Sometimes the greatest danger does not come from the outside, but from within the heart of the nation itself. When the cannons of the Civil War fell silent in 1865, America entered a new era, one of internal conflicts no longer measured by trenches and bayonets, but fought within the corridors of power, behind closed doors, and through secret plots. More than a century passed. The nation survived secession, racial upheavals, world wars. But now, at the very heart of democracy inside the White House, a different kind of war was beginning. An invisible, insidious, legal political war where the enemy was the very government meant to serve its people. Watergate was not a battle of gunfire, it was a battle of intelligence operations, covert break-ins, bribed witnesses, lies from podiums, and journalistic investigations that pushed the system to its breaking point. And at the center of this dirty drama, a president who recorded his own crimes, sealing his own downfall. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy slow-paced, in-depth stories. And be sure to tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. We love hearing where in the world you're joining us from. America in the early 1970s. A nation on the brink. For nearly a decade, the United States had been fighting a brutal and increasingly senseless war in Vietnam. Thousands of soldiers were dying in the jungles while millions protested in the streets. The war with television, as it was called, Americans watched the blood and corpses on their living room screens, live. Trust in the government was evaporating fast. Student riots, anti-war marches, civil rights demonstrations, racial uprisings, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. The nation was boiling with public anger. Radical groups like the Weather Underground openly plotted bombings. The military struggled to contain demonstrations, while police often responded with harsh force. America teetered between anarchy and repression. The Cold War only poured fuel on the fire. The FBI and CIA were conducting secret operations against American citizens. The FBI's COINTELPRO program, surveillance of activists, wiretapping, blackmail. The CIA operated even inside the U.S., violating domestic laws. The government was spying on its own people. Amid this storm, Richard Nixon became president, a man of complex nature, a brilliant strategist in foreign policy, opening China, negotiating with the USSR, yet at the same time, obsessed with control, hostile toward the media, convinced he was surrounded by conspiracies. For Nixon, politics was a battlefield. He believed he was encircled by enemies, journalists, Democrats, the liberal elite, students, even members of his own administration. All of this created the perfect breeding ground for what would become Watergate. Politics built on fear, espionage, total control, and the belief that anything was permissible in the name of power. In 1972, the stakes for Richard Nixon were incredibly high. His first term had been filled with scandals, protests, and growing distrust. But a victory in the upcoming election could solidify his power and prove to all his enemies that he was unbreakable. Although Nixon's approval ratings were actually quite strong, his inner circle was gripped by paranoia. The Democrats might unite behind a strong candidate. The protest movement could escalate before the election. The media remained hostile. Left-wing activists were organizing demonstrations almost weekly. This created an atmosphere of total mobilization inside the White House. Thus was born the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, a name that would soon become synonymous with the Watergate conspiracy. Officially, it was the campaign organization for Nixon's re-election. Unofficially, it was a headquarters for espionage, blackmail, and political sabotage. Key figures included John Mitchell, former Attorney General, head of the committee; John Dean, White House counsel, the brain behind many of the operations; G. Gordon Liddy, the fanatic operations planner with outlandish schemes; Howard Hunt, former CIA operative, master of covert operations. Earlier, after the scandal involving the Pentagon Papers, a massive leak of classified Vietnam War documents, the White House had already created a special unit, the Plumbers, tasked with stopping further leaks. Originally, their mission was to prevent damaging disclosures, but very soon their activities expanded far beyond that, spying on political opponents, breaking into Democratic offices, bribing witnesses, conducting psychological operations. At CREEP meetings, ideas were floated that today seem straight out of a spy thriller: illegal wiretapping of Democratic headquarters, stealing internal documents, spreading disinformation in the press, financing provocateurs within the opposition. This was no longer a political campaign. It was a covert operation designed to seize control of the entire political battlefield. And soon, this machine would make its fatal mistake, organizing a break-in at the Democratic offices in the Watergate complex. The greatest political disasters often begin with small mistakes. So it was here. What seemed like a minor break-in at a political opponent's office would ignite a chain reaction that would destroy an entire administration. The Watergate complex in Washington, a luxury location, housed the headquarters of the Democratic Party. This was the target chosen by Nixon's team. In the early hours of June 17, 1972, around 2 a.m., 5 men broke into the office to install wiretaps, to photograph documents, to gather compromising material on opponents. Everything was proceeding according to plan, until a security guard noticed that a door lock had been taped open, a typical execution error. He called the police. Upon arrest, police found large amounts of cash, wiretapping equipment, notebooks containing contact information for White House staff. At first, the White House tried to dismiss it as the work of rogue individuals, claiming it was a private initiative. The administration was uninvolved, mere amateurs trying to make money. But journalists and investigators quickly discovered suspicious financial connections between the suspects and accounts linked to CREEP. 2 reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, took special interest in the case. In September 1972, White House Press Secretary Ron Ziegler dismissed the break-in as a third-rate burglary attempt not worth much attention. That phrase would later become a symbol of the administration's complete dishonesty. Meanwhile, Creep began paying hush money to the arrested burglars. The FBI received orders from above to limit its investigation. A full-scale cover-up operation was launched, and at this point, the conspiracy began transforming into catastrophe. The more the administration tried to hide, the deeper it pulled itself into the swamp. After the arrest of the 5 Watergate burglars, the scandal could have still been buried. But Nixon and his inner circle made a fatal decision to rely on lies, pressure, and blackmail. And this is where a new threat emerged, a journalistic investigation that would later become legendary. At the Washington Post, 2 young reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were initially assigned what seemed like an ordinary crime story. But the deeper they dug, the thicker the fog of lies became. The FBI denied them access to key information. Witnesses refused to testify. The burglars' lawyers mysteriously received large sums of money. The arrested men's accounts were linked directly to Creep funds. This was no longer a petty crime. It was starting to reek of a state-level conspiracy. In the midst of their investigation, Woodward made contact with a secret source, a man from deep inside America's intelligence structure. He was given the code name Deep Throat. His advice was brief but lethal. Follow the money. Deep Throat helped Woodward and Bernstein avoid traps, hinted at connections, but never handed them direct evidence. Only clues, only trails. It was later revealed that Deep Throat was Mark Felt, the deputy director of the FBI. As the journalists dug deeper, the threats escalated. FBI agents were dismissed. The newspaper's owners were pressured with political isolation. Contracts and business interests of the Washington Post were threatened. Wiretapping, surveillance, and attempts to bribe editors intensified. The Washington Post became virtually isolated in its pursuit of the truth. Most other media outlets remained silent or actively supported the White House's narrative. Yet Woodward and Bernstein persisted, methodically, cautiously, like chess players facing an opponent willing to resort to any dirty trick. The investigation exposed ever darker layers: bribery of judges, funding of illegal covert operations, theft of opposition documents, use of state agencies for private political warfare. Watergate was no longer about a break-in. It had become a state crime, infecting the entire presidential hierarchy. And this was only the beginning. As fragments of the truth began leaking into the public domain, the White House adopted a single strategy: total denial and information control. But the deeper the conspiracy grew, the more people became involved, and many of them knew too much. And the cover-up started to crumble. Nixon's administration systematically paid hush money to the arrested burglars and their families, financed attorneys who coordinated and shaped testimonies, bribed agents to provide appropriate statements to investigators. In effect, a parallel private law enforcement system was created to manage the silence. Inside the White House, paranoia reigned. Staff phones were wiretapped, aides spied on one another, every conversation in senior offices was secretly recorded. Enemies' lists were compiled for future political retribution. Nixon himself instead of stabilizing the situation, sank deeper into personal obsession. The Oval Office tapes reveal a man consumed by the desire for control and fear of betrayal. In 1973, the Senate established a special committee to investigate Watergate. During the hearings, White House counsel John Dean delivered explosive testimony. There was a cancer growing on the presidency. The cover-up was systemic. The president knew and approved. This was the first major fracture in the official White House narrative. To oversee the investigation, the Justice Department appointed independent special prosecutor Archibald Cox. But Cox refused to play by the White House's rules. He demanded full access to the president's recorded conversations. He refused to drop the investigation. He began to gain public and media support. On October 21, 1973, Nixon ordered Cox's dismissal. Attorney General Elliot Richardson refused and resigned. His deputy also refused and resigned. Only the third-ranking official, Robert Bork, obeyed and fired Cox. That day became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The nation was thrown into open constitutional shock. Was the White House turning into an uncontrolled dictatorship? After the massacre, members of Congress from both parties began openly discussing impeachment. Even Nixon's former allies were losing faith. But the final blow was yet to come, and it would be delivered by the tapes. Nearly everything that happened inside Nixon's White House, almost everything, was recorded. And it was this archive that would dig his political grave. In 1971, Richard Nixon installed a system of hidden microphones in the White House. They automatically recorded every conversation in the Oval Office, at Camp David, on telephone lines, and even in private meeting rooms. Nixon's motive was simple: to collect leverage on his subordinates, to document conversations for his personal record, to control the official version of events. But this obsession with control became his undoing. As investigators closed in on the recordings, the White House resisted. At first, denying the tapes even existed, then offering heavily edited transcripts, declaring portions of the tapes privileged for national security reasons. The courts and the Senate launched a legal war for access to the tapes. In July 1974, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously. The White House must release the full, unedited recordings. This became the point of no return. On one of the tapes, recorded just days after the break-in, Nixon and his aide, H.R. Haldeman, can be heard discussing a plan to order the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation, in effect, using government agencies to obstruct justice. This recording became known as the smoking gun. It was irrefutable proof of the president's direct involvement in the conspiracy. Even Nixon's staunchest Republican allies in Congress realized there was no longer any way to defend him. On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon addressed the nation. "I no longer have a strong enough base of support in the Congress to justify continuing as your president. I shall resign the presidency." It was the first and only time in U.S. history that a president resigned under the threat of impeachment. America witnessed firsthand how corruption at the highest levels of power can cripple the machinery of government itself. August 8, 1974, the White House. Evening. Richard Nixon stands before the television cameras, his face a frozen mask of exhaustion. He reads a speech that had been rewritten dozens of times. In front of him, just a sheet of paper behind him. 4 years of intrigue, deception, conspiracy, and fear. I have always tried to do what was best for the nation, but I no longer have the support necessary to govern effectively. Tomorrow, I shall resign. At that moment, America held its breath. The leader of the world's most powerful country was voluntarily stepping down, not because of a foreign enemy, not because of war, but because of corruption born within his own office. The next morning, a helicopter lifted off from the White House lawn. Nixon waved one last time. The symbol of American power was now just a private citizen. Presidential power passed to Vice President Gerald Ford, who would soon deliver the famous words, "Our long national nightmare is over." Watergate left deep and lasting consequences, a sharp decline in public trust in government, a wave of reforms to limit executive power, the strengthening of investigative journalism, an empowered and more independent judiciary. But at the same time, a new era of suspicion, constant expectation of betrayal, and institutional cynicism that would stretch on for decades. America was forever changed. Watergate ended nearly half a century ago, but its ghosts still haunt the corridors of American politics. The scandal exposed a simple truth. Any system of government is vulnerable when it places too much trust in its leader and too little in its institutions. In Nixon's case, the nation was saved by an independent press, the courage of individual witnesses, a functioning and independent judiciary, the constitutional balance of powers. But will it always be so? Can future leaders conceal their crimes more effectively? Modern America again faces political efforts to pressure law enforcement, the discrediting of independent media, information wars waged across social networks, the erosion of truth as a shared concept, the rise of cults of personality over the culture of institutions. Watergate proved that. The betrayal of democracy rarely arrives suddenly from outside. It grows quietly from within, when the temptation of power overshadows the rule of law. Nixon fell not because the Constitution failed, but because its safeguards, investigation, oversight, and separation of powers worked as they were meant to. Watergate remains a mirror that America is periodically forced to stare into once again. And the greatest threat is always the same, not from without, from within. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the story of Watergate, one of the dirtiest, most dangerous, and most instructive dramas in American political history. We have seen how, even in the world's strongest democracy, the temptation of power can drive a system to the brink of self-destruction, how lies, manipulation, and contempt for the law can rot a government from within, and at the same time, how essential it is that independent journalism, independent courts, civic courage, and the balance of powers function when they are needed most. May this story serve not only as a gripping political thriller, but as a lasting reminder to every democracy. No freedom exists automatically. It must be defended every single day. Thank you to everyone who has listened. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and let us protect the values that past generations fought so hard to secure. Picture the iconic white dome of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, the symbol of American democracy, the heart of legislative power, the place where for nearly 2.5 centuries the fate of the world's largest republic has been decided. And suddenly, this calm monument becomes the epicenter of chaos. Shouts, barricades, shattered windows, people in military gear, helmets, zip ties. American flags fly alongside the banners of conspiracy groups, lawmakers hiding in underground bunkers, police officers desperately trying to hold the line. And outside, slogans ring out that sound more like the language of a coup than of democratic protest. Stop the steal! On January 6, 2021, the United States of America, for the first time in its modern history, witnessed how, inside its own capital, not in some distant land, a mob rose up and attacked the very foundation of electoral democracy. This was not just another protest. This was the storming of the Capitol. The day America stared into the abyss. The storming of the Capitol did not arise out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years-long processes that had been eroding American politics from within. And it all began long before 2021. The 2020 presidential election was the peak of this tension. At stake was not simply who would occupy the White House, but the future of the political system itself. Donald Trump ran for a second term, actively preparing his supporters for claims of fraud. Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate, represented stability, a return to normalcy, and a call for national healing. Even before the votes were counted, Trump repeatedly declared, "The only way I can lose is if the election is rigged." That statement became the ideological foundation for the coming assault. 2020 saw an explosion of conspiracy theories. QAnon, a global network claiming Trump was battling a secret cabal of satanic pedophiles within the deep state. Disinformation spread across Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Radical platforms like Parler, 8kun, and Gab became coordination hubs for far-right groups. For millions of people, an alternate reality became their new normal. Amid the radicalization, paramilitary groups gained momentum. Proud Boys, a nationalist, violent organization. Oath Keepers, former military and law enforcement ready to use force. 3%ers, armed militias preparing for violent resistance against the government. Many of these groups openly awaited the coming of a day X, when physical confrontation with the government would begin. After preliminary results showed Joe Biden securing victory, Donald Trump launched an open campaign. They stole the election. We won't allow it. Thus, the Stop the Steal movement was born, a network of protests, rallies, and street mobilizations. Trump held rallies urging his supporters to fight to the end. Social media filled with calls to action. Some groups were openly preparing for violence long before January. When Congress convened on January 6, 2021, to certify the election results, Trump staged a rally near the White House. "We will never give up. We will never concede." After those words, his supporters began marching toward the Capitol. American democracy was about to face the most dangerous day of its new century. January 6, 2021, a date that entered U.S. history as one of the darkest days for modern democracy. On this day, America witnessed, for the first time in its modern history, an attempt to violently disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. From early morning, thousands of Donald Trump's supporters flooded into Washington, D.C. Among them were ordinary citizens convinced the election had been stolen, activists of the Stop the Steal movement, far-right groups, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, QAnon believers convinced of a global satanic cabal. The rhetoric on stage grew increasingly aggressive. "If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore," Trump declared to roaring applause. After the rally, the crowd began marching toward the Capitol, where Congress was certifying the election results. The police barricades surrounding the Capitol were never designed for this scale of aggressive confrontation. At 12:53 p.m., the first barricades were breached. By 2:11 p.m., the main defenses had collapsed. The mob smashed windows, broke doors, and flooded into the building. Inside, scenes unfolded that few could have imagined in a modern democracy. Offices ransacked, congressional workspaces looted, armed individuals with zip ties searching for traitors, chants of "Hang Mike Pence," calling for the vice president's execution. Lawmakers and Vice President Pence were evacuated through underground corridors. For several hours, the Capitol remained under the control of the mob. Police were unprepared for such organized violence. Some officers fought directly. Others were forced to retreat. That day saw multiple casualties. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, rioter Ashley Babbitt, fatally shot while trying to breach the House chamber. Several others died from various causes. Following the attack, a massive investigation was launched. Hundreds of rioters were arrested. Plots involving the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys were uncovered. Group leaders faced charges of seditious conspiracy. Dozens of FBI agents pursued a sprawling criminal conspiracy investigation. 1 week after the assault, the House of Representatives impeached Donald Trump for a second time, this time for incitement of insurrection. Though the Senate did not convict him, the impeachment became an unprecedented chapter in U.S. history. After January 6th, America was no longer the same. Debates erupted over freedom of speech and leaders' accountability. Greater attention focused on radicalized political rhetoric. New laws were proposed addressing cybersecurity, conspiracy movements, and domestic terrorism. A sobering realization emerged: the greatest threats to democracy may come not from abroad, but from within. January 6 became the day the United States realized even the most stable democracy can tremble under the blows of its own citizens.